Well, thank you very much, Rob. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming this evening. I'll just mention one thing. I have two little granddaughters, and one of them managed to give me a sort of a bug last week. So I'm glad there's some water here, because I hope my throat will stand up for the talk. But I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you very much for coming. You've got many other things to do, and finding time for this, it's a treat that you've come. I just wanted to say quickly a word about the department, because it's some years ago, but I did enjoy working in what was the Department of City and Regional Planning in those days. And it's quite clear to me that the scholars in this setting have moved forward in two main ways. Firstly, when we were in the Aberconway building, which was further up by the railway tracks, it's quite clear that now you have wider corridors. Those of you who remember that building, it's quite compact. But secondly, and more seriously, I think it's great that you're in this building. I know you've been here a while, but this is a very important civic building, the home of more than one important local government. I think it was Glamorgan County Council, then Mid Glamorgan. I want some nods from people who know. Yes, thank you. So I think that's really helpful for me tonight, because I'm going to talk quite a bit about local government, actually. So it's nice to be in a good setting for that. Last thing on background, I am an academic, but I'm also quite keen on practice. So when I started my career, I worked in local government in different cities in England for many years before I became a scholar. So I worked for 10 years in different cities. And I've always had this fondness and a passion, really, for connecting academic work to practice and the other way around. And I know many of you in this room share that agenda. And I've tried to do that in this book. And I'm a part-time academic, maybe I should say that, at the University of the West of England. The rest of the time, I've got a company that's called Urban Answers, which is my vehicle for working with cities and local authorities in different countries. So as we talk, and we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion, maybe trying to link scholarly analysis to practice could be a theme. Okay, thank you for mentioning the book. I'm going to talk about this book. Maybe just a couple of things. In the talk, I'm going to speak about leadership, about place-based leadership. And I will suggest to you that in the modern world, placeless power has grown enormously, and that is a bad thing, and that we need to strengthen place-based power against placeless power. Placeless leaders are not bad people. It's just that when they make their decisions, they are not considering or thinking about or caring about places and communities. So I'm thinking of multinational companies in particular that will invest or disinvest because of the bottom line for their company rather than for the strengths and weaknesses of the argument for the particular place. So that's a key theme in the whole analysis. I'll talk about urban trends. I will talk about examples of inspirational place-based leadership that I hope will give you some encouragement for what's possible, particularly in city planning and urban design, but also in public management. And then maybe throw a few ideas out for discussion at the end. Okay, let's see how we go. The first off then is urban trends. And in this presentation, there will be pictures of cities. I've got quite a few pictures. Every picture is of a city that's in the book. You'll be pleased to know I'm not going to talk about all 17 cities. That would not be a good idea. But I did want to give a sense of the scope. That's Portland, Oregon, which is probably the greenest city in the US. Anybody from Portland, Oregon? Yes, excellent. You can give me some tough questions later on. Beautiful city with a very effective city planning department, in my view, and a real commitment to equity as well as sustainable development. But in this opening section, I want to talk about urban trends. Now, many of us urban scholars, when we talk about cities, we focus, and this is a good thing, quite strongly on the problems of cities, the growth of unsustainable development, of inequality, major issues that have to be faced. And we sometimes overlook how fabulous cities are. So I just wanted to put one slide up with 8 cities, just of pictures of, these are all in the book, of the wonderful cities that we're fortunate living our lives at this point in time. We can actually go to wonderful cities across the world. Chicago's up there. That was where I was in my last job. I was the Dean of the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs at the University of Illinois at Chicago. So I'm tempted to talk about Chicago probably too much. Copenhagen, Freiburg, Malmö, Ahmedabad, Hamamatsu, Auckland, Guangzhou. One or two of these will reappear in the presentation. I'm not going to go through all of them. That would be a bad idea. Let's look at the urban trends. This is from the UN. The UN has a wonderful resource for those of us interested in population trends and urbanization. You can go on this website and examine trends in any continent or place. This is from their data 2011. In 1900, 13% of the world population lived in cities. I know there's some definitional issues here about how do you define a city, but let's just go with the flow for a minute. Everyone in this room knows that round about 2008, the world went urban. Before that date, most people alive on the planet did not live in cities, and after that date, most of us did. In 2014, it's actually quite a bit more than 50% in cities. It's 24%. And then the prediction is UN, we go up to 66%. So we have an unprecedented urbanization of the planet. And I've got another graph to show this, and I think this one's actually more helpful because it's actually actual figures. So again, we're in 1900. The number of people living in cities, 220 million. 1950, 732 million. So it's picking up. This is when we go past 50-50. In 2011, 3.6 billion in cities, around about 3.5 billion not in cities. So we'd gone urban before this. The next one is the most important for the discussion tonight. 2030, it will be 5 billion. 2050, 6.3. There's more up-to-date figures actually on the UN website that slightly modify some of the detail here, but the key for tonight is this change. 1.4 billion by 2030. We're 2015, that's 15 years. This is not long-term forecasting. This is going to happen. That's unprecedented in human history. So the good news for those who, how many of you in the room are studying city planning or geography? Can get a few hands up here. Thank you very much. And we've got some academics teaching these disciplines. Can we hear some? Put your hands up if you're a scholar. Yes, few. Thank you. Anyone doing urban design, architecture, people like that? Maybe one or two? Excellent. Well, the good news is, for those of you on these careers, there's an enormous amount of work to do. Urban expansion, unprecedented. These cities need planning, designing, managing. For the younger ones here, I would think internationally about your career because, as I'll show in a moment, quite a lot of this expansion is not in this country. I've got two maps now, just to set the scene for the talk about leadership. This is a map of the 20 largest cities in the world in 1950. New York, the blue histogram is the size of the city. So New York City, 12.3 million, was the biggest city in the world in 1950. Closely followed by Tokyo, I think it's about 11.5 million in those days. I think then those were the only two megacities in the world. In other words, a city with more than 10 million. So we've got two. And then as you can see, London 8.3 million then, and it actually is more or less that now. It's gone down and then back up. But just hold in your mind, if you can, where those 20 cities are, because I'm going to show you another map. It's the map of the world with blue bars to the same scale, showing the biggest cities in the world in 2025. It's the same scale on the blue bars. And look where the cities are now and where they're going to be. Quite a lot to take in there, I think, but just 2 or 3 points. This is the same scale. The first thing is the size of the biggest cities in the world is leapt up. So Tokyo is the biggest city in the world in 2025. I think it's about 37 million. So it's not just mega, it's not just double mega, it's treble mega, it's nearly quadruple mega. Tokyo is the biggest. As you can see, New York is still a pretty big city, but it's not up in the large group. Delhi is the second biggest, and I think it's Shanghai is the third in terms of just sheer size of population. Have a look at the big cities in Europe and Russia on this map. They're not there. So from the previous map, Moscow and London and so on have disappeared. So you can see, and I'd admit it's a fairly simple presentation, but you can see that the major cities of the world are going to be in parts of the world where they have not been in the past. It's the developing countries mainly. Actually, you can see it's a lot in China, but India, growing cities in Latin America and in Africa. But there's 2 or 3 points to make here. One is the sheer scale of these cities. Secondly, they're in different places than in the past. I think the third thing is the pace of the growth of cities. And actually, in this department, you've got a fine track record of studying China. This is long since I left. In the more recent past, there's been some excellent work done on Chinese cities by colleagues, some of whom might be in this room, on some of this development. So congratulations on that. I want to just pause for a moment, though, because I think we get kind of quite fascinated by these mega cities, or these are all double mega. You don't get on this map unless you're over 20 million. But in a way, it's sort of misleading because most of that 1.4 billion growth that I mentioned will not be in the mega cities. It will be in cities of less than 5 million. So that urban planning city management challenge is actually dispersed across the whole, just about the whole world. So we tend to notice these massive places which signal something rather special, but in a way, a more significant trend is the urban growth overall. Last thing to say about urban growth, and I am keeping it very simple tonight, there's lots more could be said. Not every city is growing. So we have shrinking cities in some parts of the world. Detroit is probably the most striking example, where the older industrial cities, but this would be a classic, population has left, and now you've got large areas of vacant land in what was once a massive industrial city. Cleveland, Ohio is another in North America. I know those 2 cities fairly well, but you've also got that happening in what we used to think of as Eastern Europe, and there are other places with shrinking cities. Sometimes these are called declining cities, and I think that language is unhelpful. I think the word shrinking is quite well thought through, because it might be that to reduce in size actually improves prospects and possibilities. It's not necessarily a bad thing. So I just want to qualify, I'm talking about this grand urban sweep and the growth of cities, but there are more interesting things going on. Other places are shrinking, not declining, shrinking, but maybe losing prosperity as well. So that's my opening sort of backdrop to talk about urbanization. And I realize for this audience, some of that's probably not completely astonishing because you're urban studies scholars. You'll be familiar with many of those trends. But I do this kind of presentation with colleagues who are less into academic analysis of cities. And I think people are often quite startled by how dramatic the shifts are and how big the challenges are. Okay, that's a picture of Bristol, in case you're wondering where that one is. Bristol does feature, and I live in Bristol, and I like Bristol, and there's some interesting things to say about Bristol. And it is in the book. This is the City Hall in the middle. This is College Green, the cathedral. We are very fortunate. That's the suspension bridge at the top over the Avon Gorge. And we have, and maybe this is something for Q&A later if you like, we have a directly elected mayor in our city, George Ferguson, who was president of the RIBA. So for those interested in architecture and urban design, it's of some interest that an urban designer has become the leader of a sizable city in the UK. He's an independent politician, so he actually beat out the political parties to become mayor. That was national news in 2012. So he beat Labour, he beat the Tories, he beat Lib Dem, and won by a direct election process the leadership of the city. He's up for election next May. But I could talk a bit more about the mayoral model of governance, which can underpin very strong outgoing leadership. Some people think I'm just a massive fan of directly elected mayors, and I've written quite a lot about it over the years. And I was involved in advising the last Labour government on the introduction of the Mayor for London, which was introduced in 2000, which many in local government opposed and said, this is not British, it's not what we like, we don't do this, we don't want a Mayor for London. It was introduced, and Tony Blair should get some credit for this, of pushing through a model. He then got a leader he did not want because the voters chose Ken Livingstone, which was not the Labour Party's preferred candidate. It wasn't their candidate at all. But what's interesting is all those opponents to directly elected mayors, you found nobody arguing, I can't find anybody arguing to get rid of the Greater London mayor. The Conservatives are now for Boris Johnson, but I think there the models proved itself in a metropolitan setting to be a very sensible model of leadership. And I know cities across the world that would beg to get that kind of institutional design for their metropolis that gives that high-profile leadership. So I throw this out for a bit of debate. I'm not trying to say everywhere should have directly elected mayors. There is some evidence that it's quite effective. Bristol might be another one. There are examples where it's not been a success, and I've worked in America, so I can think of some quite good ones, where it's not been very positive. I'm just trailing that as a possible topic for discussion. What I want to do really, though, is talk about place-based leadership, which does not have to involve directly elected mayors. And I've got a couple of examples from the book to show you. In all these 17 examples, I call them innovation stories. By that I mean there is a story of remarkable change of a place going from somewhere that was not in a good place to being really quite outstanding. So it's quite lifting because it means any place can change. It might be more difficult in certain settings. Melbourne, this is 1978. That's a cutting from the Age, that's the local paper. The journalist, he's called Norman Day, he writes this article. We have in our city an empty, useless city centre, he writes. And in the text he talks about our planners lack the courage to bring our cities back to life. 1978, Melbourne, a dump. Basically, you'd got office building in the centre of the town, nobody living there, everybody left at night, so it's quite an unsafe, unpleasant place. Really bad. Now, Melbourne, according to The Economist, which is fairly rigorous, and I don't agree with everything they write, or indeed this evaluation, but they study livable cities. And Melbourne has come out #1, not in Australia, in the world, for the last 5 years in a row.
Yeah, it's all right.
It's all right. Are you from Melbourne? Yeah, good one. We've got Portland and Melbourne already. That's excellent. I'm egging it a little bit here. And, you know, there's lots of cities would say, hang on a minute, have you been to Copenhagen? And you start debating this. but it's been transformed. How have they done it? Place-based leadership. Every single one of the stories in my book, the answer to how did they do it, place-based leadership. People who care about the place working together to make a massive difference. And here, I think urban designers get a lot of credit. It's basically valuing the public realm, cars out, people first, redesign space so it's people friendly. And by the way, we're going to bring housing back into the city from having 200 or 300 residents. They've got 23,000 living in central Melbourne now. Students, quite important part of that, are RMIT. They've got wonderful attractions as well, but it's the quality of the whole place that is striking. There's a guy called Rob Adams, who's the director of city design for Melbourne. He's been there over 20 years. And it's a nice example if you're thinking of throwing up examples of professionals who've done a great job. He's done an absolutely fantastic job as an individual. But he'd be the first to say, no, it's not me. It's my 50 urban designers and all these other people who we're working with to make the city a different place. He would also say, I couldn't have done it without the politicians. So it was Labour councillors. A Labour council elected in Melbourne said, we want a higher quality public realm. They set up an urban design committee and they pushed the engineers out of the way. They said, sorry, boys and girls, highway engineering, get back in your place. It's public realm that's leading now. These urban design people are doing the decision making. And they've done a really wonderful job. In terms of the private sector, it's got advantages, Melbourne, because it's quite a good location. There's lots of strengths. They are therefore able to turn away developers who don't behave and don't comply. So they're very clear about, if you're not going to do what we say, go away. They have place-based power, and they use it to enhance the quality of the public realm. So I give it to you as an example of highly effective place-based leadership. And remember, Melbourne was a dump. You know, if you talk about some cities, you might say, oh, it's always been wonderful. I don't know, Venice or somewhere. Yes, it probably has. This is a place that was not. It's changed. Freiburg is my second one. Who's been to Freiburg in the room? I imagine we might have one or two hands go up. Richard was telling me he went on a recent visit to study the city. It probably is the greenest city in Europe. And again, you can make claims for other places. These are a couple of pictures of Vauban. This is a neighbourhood on the south side of Freiburg. Freiburg's about 220,000 people. This is not a big megacity, it's a small city. It's in southern Germany. The climate's quite good. It's expanding, and they've set just a higher level of design standards than I've seen anywhere else, actually. And that's certainly the view of a lot of independent scholars who've examined it. In Vauban, some of these houses, most of us pay an electricity bill, right? You have electricity, you use it, and you have to pay a bill. Some of the houses in Vauban are so well designed that the solar energy completely looks after all the energy needs of the home, and the resident then has an income from selling spare electricity to the grid. That is good design. It's an income because it's so well designed. These neighbourhoods are designed in a very people-friendly way, so you can't drive a car through or into Vauban, except if you've got a really good reason, like you've got your elderly mum who you need to get to the home. So this is navigable space for the urban designers here. You can actually move in and out of these spaces with vehicles, but it's quite clear the kids on the bikes they're ruling the roost. So it's very people friendly. Public transport is astonishing. It's a historic city, but they've built on that. The director of planning is another inspiring individual. He's called Wolf Dasserking. He's actually retired a couple of years ago. But he is rather like Rob Adams. He stayed in the same city for a long time and was really committed to improving the quality of the environment where he was working, where he lived. When I interviewed him about the work that they'd done, he's very robust in his language. He talked about, and I felt a bit uncomfortable because in my career in local government, I did move jobs quite a bit. I went through 4 different cities in 10 years. So I was moving around, gaining experience, and I enjoyed my work, and I learnt a lot, and hopefully I did something useful. He was very critical of people who did that. He said, I can't stand these planners who change jobs like they change their shirt. He said to me, no, you should stay and be committed and really deliver for a place. So he made his point very well, I think. And he stayed, I think, for over 20 years, rather like Rob Adams. So Freiburg, no bike paths in 1970, none. Now it's got 300 miles, so the bike routes are everywhere. The public transport is outstanding. Car ownership is going down. This is a wealthy place. I'm not saying it's not well off. They're very proud of this. Car ownership is going down because they don't want cars, and they don't need them, actually. And the awareness of energy consumption and green values is really exceptional. By the way, you might have heard of a political party called the Green Party. Where did that start? It started in Freiburg, 1970. The federal government was going to build a nuclear power station nearby, and there was a wonderful coalition of activists said, we don't like the sound of this. So farmers and businessmen and students and radicals and all sorts campaigned against this nuclear power station, actually stopped it. And they then said, this is something that's more than our little bit here in Germany. Let's create a Green Party. And of course, the Green Party has since prospered in different countries, actually. In Freiburg, the directly elected mayor is from the Green Party. I have some debates with my friends in Bristol because we've got quite a few Green councillors now in Bristol. And some of them are against directly elected mayors because they see this powerful figure who's not listening to Greens, perhaps, or not enough. Actually, George does listen to Greens quite a lot. But there's a view in the Green culture that we need a much more collective model. And I do mention to them, by the way, you should have a look at Freiburg, because there you've got a Green mayor, and the Green mayor is able to advance Green values really rather effectively. So, I'm giving you a couple of examples of inspirational civic leadership in these 2 places. And I'm keeping it very short, but I think there's some quite strong evidence here that those local leaders have made a big difference. They've made their cities more sustainable, but to varying degrees more inclusive, which is this title of this book, Leading the Inclusive City. Okay, I'm not going to keep going on with more and more examples because I think that could almost become disabling. You have another one and another one and you think, I can't make sense of any of this. So I now want to take a little bit of a deep breath and talk about some concepts. And this might be the most useful part of the talk, he said, hopefully, because in a way, as scholars, we try to understand what's happening in the world of practice in the hope that that will advance knowledge and understanding, but better still, might improve the quality of practice in other places. So the argument is place-based power matters, and I'm going to try and explain how to analyse place-based power in a place. And have we got any political scientists in the room? Have we any? Perhaps we might have. No, nobody's. 1 or 2 claim. Okay. I mean, I really have learnt a lot from political scientists, and I've tried to draw on a lot of American literature, really, about the power of place. And I'm thinking of Clarence Stone now, who's a very famous political scientist in the States, who's helped me develop some of these ideas. In the middle of this diagram is place-based governance. So there's a system in place for governing a place, and it's constrained by 4 environmental limits are at the bottom of this diagram. And I think for this audience, I don't need to make the argument too forcefully, but if we carry on developing our cities the way we have been doing, particularly in the face of the evidence about climate change, we are going to fail miserably. So there's got to be an awareness of sustainable planning, sustainable design, sustainable development. If you notice, that is solid in this diagram. So I'm suggesting that's not negotiable. The other 4 sides of this diagram are malleable, and there's room for some debate about how powerful or not powerful these forces should be. On this side, are the economic drivers that shape prosperity in places to varying degrees. There are some American scholars, I'm thinking of Paul Peterson's book, which is called City Limits, 1981. He argued that unless cities serve capital, in other words, respond to the economic forces, they're finished. And his analysis really was very brutal along the lines of you have to respond to the markets, to the power of capital, otherwise you cannot prosper. It's a neoliberal view of the world. Over here is what I call the socio-cultural framing. Here, you've got people living in cities who might actually have some feelings about the quality of life they want in their place. They might be community activists, they might be local businesses, they might be religious institutions, they might be universities actually. They've got some views about the kind of place they want, and families thinking about their kids and the quality of life they want that may well be in conflict with the needs of this globalized marketplace. In fact, they are in conflict a lot of the time. So you've set the scene here then for this conflict between placeless power. Remember I talked about placeless power? The decision makers who are unconcerned about place, and the decision makers coming the other way, or the pressures saying, hang on a minute, we care about this place, we want it to be this way, not that way. At the top of the diagram is what I call governmental framing. So in any city, in any place, chances are there's a higher level of government imposing requirements on the lower levels about how it's going to be governed, what the powers are that local governments have, what the election arrangements are, what the financing system is. So in our country, I'll speak for England now, I'm English, and we have a different scenario in Wales, so I must be very careful here. In England, we have the most centralised state in the Western world, so the governmental framing is crushing place into place to force it to behave in line with what ministers want. It's absolutely extreme, even now, under the rhetoric around devolution. Central government has taken extraordinary power into the central state. It's unheard of anywhere else, telling local localities what they're going to do. All this Northern Powerhouse rhetoric is actually a mask for a devolution deception where the central state is taking yet more power to decide what's going to happen in each place. Other countries don't do that, lucky for us. I like to use Sweden, where the local government is very, very autonomous. 80% of Swedes pay no income tax to central government. Only the wealthy 20% pay any. All the income tax goes to local government. Local government runs just about everything, including the health service. They're enormously powerful. The voter turnout in local elections in England, argue about it over time and varying, it's about 35 to 40%. That's the voter turnout in local elections. It's gone down since I worked in local government, when it was about 45 to 50%. Over the years, local government's been weakened, and voters are sensible. They think, well, there's not much point voting. In Sweden, they're worried because the voter turnout is just in danger of dipping under 70%. That is devolution. That would be a powerful devolved model of government. Massive power in the local state, massive electoral power in the electorate of localities. This is not what central government in England is talking about. But in terms of analysing place, there's lots of variation of how powerful the state is. In my last job in the US, I'm working in Illinois, and localities have home rule. They are respected as independent places. So the idea of the central state of Illinois telling places inside Illinois what to do couldn't even be discussed. Never mind actually introduced and done. It would be, what do you mean? I remember talking to Mayor Daley, this is probably off the record, but he was mayor in those days, and he was coming to give a speech in Manchester about urban regeneration. He got on very well with John Prescott, our Deputy Prime Minister, and John came over and he went back. And I gave him a briefing to help him get ready to come and talk, and I explained local government finance in the UK to him. He wouldn't believe me. He said, you can't be serious, that the central state determines the level of local taxation. You have capping introduced by Margaret Thatcher. So the central state says this is the level of local tax. That's inconceivable in America. So I throw that out as another possible topic for debate. But the point about this diagram is there is some space in here. These are dotted lines, and at different times in history, the power of place can be expanded. So it's not fixed. I think the environmental limits are fixed, but the other sides of the square are a bit variable. Okay, this is probably the most important diagram for tonight, because I've talked a little bit about leadership, not too much, but this is a simple diagram of what I mean by place-based leadership. And I'm suggesting to you that in any place there are 5 realms, and it will vary. And I've got criticism from colleagues who've said, this is way too simple, Robin. If you came in my city, it's more complicated. Yes, yes, yes. Conceptual frameworks have to simplify so that we can make sense, and then we get back in complexity. At the top are the elected politicians. They are the political leaders of the place. So in Wales, we've got elected councillors, and we've got politicians who are answerable to the electorate. Over here, you've got public managerial professional leadership, by which I mean professionals, managers appointed by the state to serve public purpose. When I worked in local government, that's where I was, and many of you have worked in local government or for the state. You're not elected. You bring professional managerial skill to the task, and you may be working alongside and with government as consultants and so on. But in my view, those are leaders. Sometimes planners and others say to me, Robin, we're not actually the leaders, it's the politicians who are the leaders. We have to respect the politicians. Yes, of course you do. They are the elected authority. But don't tell me you're not a leader. You've got professional knowledge and skill. And by the way, you're probably working full-time, so you can bring leadership to the place. I've already mentioned Rob Adams and Wolf Dasseking as inspiring civic leaders. They were in this realm. They're not going off doing their own thing without their politicians. They work in that innovation zone. The grey areas are the innovation zones, the areas of overlap where creative things can happen if you orchestrate the process. You might say, okay, I can see that. What are these other 3 realms? Community leaders are those who care about the place and often live in it and have their own tacit knowledge of what's desired and what they want. And they campaign often against the state. There's often a lot of conflict in this zone of local groups, local activists feeling the state's not listening. That's very common. But good leaders reach out and include these groups. I'm going to come back to one example before I finish of a community initiative that's been very effective. Business leaders, absolutely critical to the success of a place, and I'm distinguishing place-based business from placeless business. You know, I talked about different kinds of decision makers. Most businesses are not placeless. I'm not anti-business in my presentation and arguments here. I'm really pro-business. I'm pro-place-based business that cares about the place. So political leaders have to be very sophisticated in dealing with these people and distinguishing those who do care about the place from those who don't. And that's what Melbourne does very well. They turn away developers who just want to make profit from a place. They just don't want them to be there. Trade unions varies this, but in certain places, the trade unions can offer a great leadership role. I'm thinking of New York City now, where the unions are very strongly established and make an enormously important public contribution to the leadership of the place. So you get the idea of the diagram. All the realms overlap. It took me a while to work this diagram out. There are dotted lines, so they're permeable. There's no solid lines here. And some people in their careers may work across these boundaries. I think the heart of civic leadership is probably in this area where you get these different voices together. Now, often at this point, certainly with practitioners, I get reactions along the lines of, actually, we can see this diagram, it works. But Robin, those grey areas that you call innovation zones, in my city, they're conflict zones. These are battlegrounds where there's fights going on about priorities and decision making. And my answer to that is yes, exactly. That's true. Good leaders understand that and work with the conflict to generate new understanding by processes of listening and engagement. Very easy to say, very hard to do. But I call, my definition of leadership is shaping emotions and behavior to achieve common goals. So it's shaping emotions, it's how people are feeling, which is actually neglected in political science. There's not enough on feeling. It's about shaping emotions and behavior to achieve goals that are shared, not the goals of some heroic leader. So leadership studies get a bad deal, I think, in urban studies and planning. There's very little written on it because I think a lot of people think of leadership studies being about this top-down hierarchical model, which has been out of fashion in leadership studies for about 30 or 40 years. Okay, that's the model. If we just, this is not new, the frame that I showed you, got the four sides, and there are the realms inside it. So in a way, that's one composite diagram of the whole layout. And then this last one, planners quite like this. This is not a new diagram. Well, it's a new diagram. It's the same information where you have agency exercised by place-based leaders that's influenced by the governmental structure, the social-cultural forces, the economic, environmental limits, constraining. Innovation takes place, reshapes the context. So I'm trying to suggest there's some possibilities here in every place to develop strong place-based leadership. But it needs to be quite inclusive as a political process to make much impact. How am I doing? 5 minutes and then I'll stop? Okay. I think I'm going to go through quite quickly one or two more examples, and then I'm going to stop and get some reactions from colleagues. I'll just have another glass of water. That's Guangzhou. Have we got anyone from China in the room here? Have we got any Chinese students? One or two. Hello, anyone from Guangzhou? No? No? Okay, I'm safe then. I can probably say things. Well, congratulations on coming to study here. Excellent. That is Guangzhou. You remember I showed you the map with the big megacities? Guangzhou is one of those, 23 million in 2025. And I did some work with Guangzhou 2 or 3 years ago, and I discovered that they'd created the largest bus rapid transit system in Asia. Now, those who study transport policy and so on will be familiar with this concept, but it was invented in Curitiba. Curitiba is in my book as well. There you had visionary leadership that created the idea of a bus rapid transit system. Do people know what a BRT is? I'm going to say what it is because I think sometimes people think it's just bus lanes. No, no. A BRT, if you think of a metro or a subway, and say, well, we're not going to have it underground, we're going to have it on the roads. So you're going to take road space away from the cars and make it totally bus and have redesigned stations for people to get on and off buses, rather like a metro. And this is a view down the one in Guangzhou, which is the biggest in Asia, but they've got a capacity of moving people in this corridor that matches a metro. I've got the figures in the book, but it's absolutely astonishingly high numbers of people can move up and down this corridor. The key point is it's 10% of the cost of a metro. It's absolutely astonishing. You're shaking your head, you're not sure?
Definitely not. The environmental cost would overwhelm. The use of diesel in buses like that would overwhelm the environmental cost of electricity generated from renewable sources.
That's a fair point, and they are bringing in green buses, well, greener buses. So there's a good point there about the environmental cost. But if you look at the infrastructure and the sheer build and all that, digging underground and building is very, very expensive.
Curitiba are introducing light rail.
They are now building on the rapid transit system that covers the whole of the metropolis. So they can strengthen it with that. They're a bit better off now. When they introduced it, it was a very poor city, and now it's a bit more prosperous. So I think there's something about learning from the south where without the resources to build metro, I mean, that's what Curitiba did. They couldn't afford to build metro, so they were going to do something else. What I like about this story is the Chinese leaders went to Latin America. They said, well, we are not quite sure what to do, but we've heard about things. And they actually went to Bogota, which has got a very developed system. So in leadership terms, when the mayor started to move to introduce it, bear in mind the traffic congestion and the pollution was unbelievable before. It was all jammed. They then started taking space away from the cars and made it even worse. So there was massive protest, even in a, call it a communist country with a strong state. There were issues about whether this could be done. But to be fair to the leaders, they listened a lot. They introduced a lot more bike networking to the stations, but they carried on with the introduction of the new model. So there's something about resilience of leadership, actually being strong enough to take pressure and then still move through. So that's another example of a city, and that's a big city, doing leadership. Has anyone been to the High Line in New York City? Maybe one or two? Yes? Good. I think the High Line is now really quite famous in urban design as a public space, but in the book I wanted to not particularly document what they did, but how they did it. That is an aerial view of the High Line, which goes down the side of Manhattan when it was a freight train. It's about a second-story height, elevated structure. Before all the highways were built, this was where most of the freight came from the docks out into the US. Enormously important. It became less well used because of the road network transporting the goods. In 2001, Mayor Giuliani was pressured by developers who were greedy to, this is Manhattan, probably the hottest property market in the world. You can imagine the value of the land down here. Mayor, please demolish this dilapidated structure and we'll build and it'll all be a lot better. So he said, okay, fine, we'll demolish it. That line goes through two gay neighborhoods. There's two gay guys, Joshua David and Robert Hammond, who are not urban designers, just guys living their lives, who like this structure because it's sort of slightly romantic, dilapidated thing going through the city. And it's something about the history of the place. And there was a community meeting called, well, it was a community meeting, but it later became called Friends of the High Line, where they went and they met at this meeting and said, well, we quite like this structure. Can't we do something about it? Well, it's going to be difficult because this was just before Giuliani decided to demolish it. But we can make a campaign. And they networked a bit, and they got some artists interested. Artists were quite important, photographers and some media people. Along the line, this is a historic asset. This is an incredible historic structure in the middle of Manhattan. Are we serious about demolishing it? Got one or two councillors who thought this might be a good idea. Giuliani steps down as mayor. In comes Bloomberg, Mayor Bloomberg, the new mayor. They lobbied Bloomberg. Bloomberg reverses the decision to demolish the High Line. So this is not City Hall leading. City Hall's going in the wrong direction. It's going to demolish it. It's community activism across a network of groups who are very clever at the way they went about it. And now you've got this wonderful walkway through the heart of Manhattan. This is an aerial view of it, perhaps a better one. I mean, the urban design is breathtakingly good. It's open public space. They've got the wheelchair access at many points along it. And the first time I went there, I must admit, I could barely believe it. If you know New York City, it's really busy and people are very, very focused on doing their thing. It's a bit in your face as a place culturally. If you go on the High Line, you see quite a lot of people holding hands. And I wanted to paint on that as an example of urban design indicators. How many people are holding hands in this space? I think it could be quite a good signal. You get the romantic couples, you get the little kids, you get quite extraordinary right in the middle. The planners and the lawyers did a brilliant bit of technical work on transposing values underneath the High Line into adjacent property, displacing value, so the developers actually aren't that unhappy because other development is taking place nearby. They didn't get totally screwed. And you could say, well, I don't care about developers. Well, you might do because you want developers to invest and do things. So I'm not saying it's perfect. Last year it had 6 million visitors, which is almost too many now. It's so popular. People go to New York to go on the High Line. Some members of my family lived near it actually for a while, and it is, and used it a lot. It's a breathtakingly successful public space. How did they do it? Place-based leadership. It was very local in these neighbourhoods that then grew with councillors on the City Hall and then eventually Mayor Bloomberg. And now it's really quite well respected. I've got one last example. This is from South Africa. And I just want to chip this in. We are in a university building tonight. And I think in some cities, we do see universities making a marvellous contribution to place-based leadership. In other words, the scholars have come out of the cloistered realm and got involved in the place. And we've got some great examples in Britain, actually. This one is an informal settlement. You know, I mentioned that population growth in the developing countries. South Africa is an example of that. So you get enormous settlements growing around the edges of cities. I'm looking at Alison now, who's a world expert on these things. But you get sort of ramshackle development. And the argument was, well, we've got to get rid of these and make it all planned. And now it's recognised that's impossible. We couldn't possibly do that. The resources, even in South Africa, they've realised that. So it's how can we reshape these settlements into more creative use? And here you've got students of town planning, like some of you in the room, doing a project with residents in, it's called Langrug, this particular informal settlement. These are plans on the floor where they're working out maybe we could realign these shacks and do things a bit differently with this space to create something more livable, even though it's still very poor, like really poor. And the 2 T's came out in the discussion. It's taps and toilets. If you can get those in the right place or somewhere, you can create a fulcrum that starts to deal with some of the sanitation problems. And there, it's just a wonderful story of a hairdresser. They created a hairdresser salon near the taps and toilets and a little community. And that became a focus. Often it's the women, of course, who are driving the improvement and pushing things along, unsung, as it often is the case. And it's great because this project got the prize, I think the South African Town Planning Institute recognised this as a really quite inspiring example of community development. So I wanted to bring in just one example of right at the nitty-gritty, low-budget end. You know, we can go up to maybe the High Line that's quite high-end, high investment sort of project, or even across to Melbourne that I mentioned, where you've got investment across a whole central area. But I'm going to make just 3 remarks, then I'm going to stop and open up for discussion. Just 3 points. I hope, firstly, that I've convinced you that there's something quite dramatic taking place in terms of urbanisation. And you may say you knew it already, but hopefully I'm reinforcing this staggering change, unprecedented in human history. So we've got a massive challenge. I think it's a great opportunity because we can design and plan these places to make them just and fair and inclusive. So I'm not discouraged by this because they're not there yet. We can actually do something about it. Secondly, place-based leadership could play a really important part in creating much better quality cities than we've tended to have in the past. So it's different in different areas and there's different ways the power structures operate, but there's real space for place-based leaders to make a difference. And the last thing, I think just because of that last slide, but because of the audience tonight, I think universities can be really quite important players in improving the quality of the environment, but also life chances in the city where they exist. Thank you very much.